love, justice, and joy. We extend a special welcome to our visitors this morning. We're very happy that you're here, and we invite you to stop by our newcomer table after the service if you haven't already, so that we can get you any information that you'd like about our congregation and put you on our e-list so that you know what's happening here. Again, welcome one and all to UU Princeton this morning. Happenings in the back of your order of service has announcements about many of our upcoming events and activities, including that Our Whole Lives Lifespan Sexuality Education has curriculums for people of all ages, and we are offering the series for adults this year. OWLS, as the program is called, is a joint creation of the Unitarian Universalist Association and our closest cousins in the U.S. religious family, the United Church of Christ, to offer progressive, open, and affirming sexuality education. An introductory workshop to the adult version of this series will be held today at 12 noon in Foz Theater. Please stop by if you're interested to learn more about the program. You are also invited to join members of UU Princeton's Rainbow Ministry for a second workshop, this one interfaith, that unpacks the myths and misinformation behind transphobia. On October 22nd, also at noon, we'll be welcoming multiple Princeton area denominations to UU Princeton for a discussion, as well as a Q&A session, exploring how our different faith traditions call us away from today's climate of hatred and intolerance and toward an ethic of love and care in defense of trans youth and other vulnerable members of the beloved community. Again, that's 2 weeks from today after worship. Please mark your calendars. And lastly, we are so pleased to welcome some friends this morning from Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Summit, New Jersey, and from the Unitarian Universalist Church at Washington Crossing. Several students and their adults from both programs are with us today as part of their neighboring faiths and Compass Points curriculum, which, among other things, encourages groups to visit other houses of worship so that we can learn about each other and get to know one another. Beacon and Washington Crossing, it's so wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us this morning. And when you head back home, please give your outstanding ministers, Emily, Robin, and Kim, the very best from Jennifer and me. Welcome you all. Thank you for coming. And now we begin with words from the Reformed Jewish prayer book. There is a grace that every dawn renews, a loveliness making every morning fresh. We will endure, we will prevail, we the children of hope, children of the one who crowds the heaven with stars, endows the earth with glory, and fills the mind with wonder. Let us worship together. And in light of this weekend's violence in the Middle East, and with hearts aching for peace for all in those lands, this morning's prayer begins with words from the Reformed Jewish prayer book. Let us pray. Sing the song of people joined in understanding and respect, the song of God's miracles, an earth protected and cherished, a gift for our children and generations to come, the song of a land once ravished by war, now quiet and content. Her soldiers home to leave no more. The song of a world redeemed. The song of peace. And great presence of peace hold us fast to this vision. Even when war rages, even when violence reigns, even when despair tempts us with its dirge, sing within us this song, the one we would sing to all children, the one we would sing to those we love, the one we would sing with our last words. Your song of peace, from which we can turn but can always turn back. Join our voices in its harmony, that our lives may counter the despair of this moment, may bring hope to hopeless times, and may be beacons of love and peace in this world of our making. And here in the silence of this sacred space, we offer these, the prayers and meditations of our hearts. May it be so, and amen.
It is a pleasure and honor to talk about the freedom movement in the South in the 1960s. Recall that the Supreme Court passed Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, deciding that separate schools were inherently unequal. In effect, this outlawed separated education in public schools. The Black lawyer Thurgood Marshall designed the attack on the separate but equal schools concept, employing Black children and dolls, most Black and colored and white. A very exciting trial, closely watched both in the South and the North, and a great victory. Marshall was very proud of his victory, but a year later he was depressed when he began to realize what a small effect had happened so far, feeling that very little will change in the segregated school for many years to come. My doctorate was also in 1954, and thus I was about to embark on my life's profession. I was excited both about research and teaching. I grew up in terrible Jim Crow and had always hoped I might do something to help end it. So I tried to find a university position in the South, as this is where the action was going to be. I did find one position in Louisiana, but at far too low a pay. In the meantime, the Soviet Union put up this satellite Sputnik. This made support for young people in science, and I got a fellowship learning and doing research at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Princeton. This was my first time ever in New Jersey. And it had been, being at the Institute had been a dream of mine for many years. I took a post after, so that was 1959 through 61. Then I took a postdoc in Chicago, thinking mostly about my own career. But I also began attending weekly SNCC meetings, that's SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Most meetings on the south side of Chicago where most Blacks lived. SNCC, we were a support group for the action in the South. We raised money, collected food, organized demonstrations and public meetings to raise money. The Black comedian Dick Craigie helped us, often giving the lead-off talk. Once, having been returned from Birmingham, Alabama, he quipped, "I didn't see much of the city, but the jail is wall to wall us." One of the tactics of the freedom movement was to get so many arrests for civil disobedience as to fill the jails. Our work with SNCC was mostly supporting the freedom movement, but I get to take part in two of the most famous demonstrations. First, a train was chartered for the March on Washington in August of 1963. The train was a bit of a celebration in itself, as it included several support groups. Some of us danced half the night. We arrived in DC next morning and followed the multitudes, packing the area between Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. My 5-year-old daughter was mostly on my shoulders. It was a long day, and when we got back to the train, we mostly slept. This march is mostly remembered as the Martin Luther King speech, the I Have a Dream speech. A couple of years later, an airplane was chartered to go to the Montgomery for the last day of the Selma to Montgomery March. This was famous for beginning at the Ed Pettus Bridge, the spot of tragic killings by white supremacists. We took part in the last few miles of the march and gathered for final speeches in a university setting. There was some talk of the lack of chairs. We were sitting on the grass when a black neighbor and I sat for a while back to back, making our own chair. We spotted a man in the proverbial raincoat taking pictures of us. They were clearly being watched. We were being watched. There were some tense moments, but nothing more. When we got back to the airport, the green lawns looked so inviting. Would they let us sit down on that grass? In fact, there was no objection, and many of us took advantage of sitting on the grass. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much for sharing those memories during worship this morning. We really appreciate it. It was great to hear that. Thank you so much. Y'all sound so good. You're ringing those bells this morning. That was great. Thank you. They're playing on Christmas Eve too, the late service on Christmas Eve. Later, it's like 6 or 7. We're figuring out, but it'll be there then too. We have a reading this morning. It's the brief poem titled A Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? My earliest memory of Martin Luther King Jr. involves a bulletin board in elementary school. This was probably 2nd or 3rd grade, and our teacher was decorating the bulletin board in celebration of his birthday. She often decorated that board while we were there in the classroom with her so that she could explain what she was putting up and why. And she would often call on some students to help her as she stapled construction paper letters and pictures to the cork background. I remember at her invitation handing her a picture of him in a clerical robe. She said that he was a minister. This was before my church-going days, so I only had the vaguest sense of what that meant. From the picture, I associated it with always having to wear a strange robe, and that did not interest me at all. When I thought of what I wanted to be when I grew up, I knew I wanted a more exciting uniform like firefighter or linebacker. That's why I'm wearing shoulder pads under this robe. And I'm just kidding, I'm not wearing shoulder pads. I remember her saying that he was from the South. This is when we lived in Western Pennsylvania. A year or two later, we would move to the South, and I would, for the most part, grow up there. But at the time, I couldn't have identified Alabama on a map, and I knew nothing about how racial dynamics in particular and relational dynamics in general differ in different parts of the country, not just north-south, but urban, rural, suburb, west, middle, east coast, to say nothing of class and other distinctions within and among groups everywhere. The world was pretty small back then, a silo of similar thinking and simple problems with obvious solutions, a mindset that is appropriate for early grade schoolers and is appropriate to grow out of soon thereafter. I remember our teacher reading aloud a few excerpts of the I Have a Dream speech and being particularly caught up in the language of sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners breaking together again in those red hills, breaking bread together in those red hills of Georgia. Knowing that slavery had ended a long time ago, I remember someone asking my teacher why people couldn't do that during King's Day, which led to our introduction to Jim Crow and segregation, and the clear awareness that King was speaking to a different time and place. He was truly located in history for me then. Another clear memory of Martin Luther King Jr. happened in 7th grade when I was getting ready for school one morning and heard that specific portion of the I Have a Dream speech on the morning news. That was the first time I had heard his voice or seen a video of him speaking. They showed most of the last part of the speech, the passionate dream repetitions and his repeated proclamations to let freedom ring from so many different places across the country. I was mesmerized by that speech. I wanted it to go on, and I even switched channels to try and find it on another news broadcast. I went to the school library that day during lunch and found a copy of the speech in this book of famous speeches and photocopied it and stuck it on my bedroom wall. It stayed there for a long time, sharing space with posters of dogs and cars and famous Pittsburgh Steelers. Those were the beginnings of a lifetime of deep respect and admiration for King. For many years, I answered that question of, if you could meet one person in history, who would it be, with Dr. King. His voice, courage, and leadership awakened so many people that it transformed the civil rights movement and the nation. His dream awakened the same dream in countless others, and even decades after he preached it, the dream still speaks to many today. He wasn't alone in his activism, of course. He was joined by known and unknown activists and everyday citizens whose lives presented them with the chance to risk everything in pursuit of equality, in some cases to quite literally risk death to make life better for those to come, for us. But he did help serve them through his servant leadership in ways that energized, challenged, and unified them. He was one who joined other ones to help build a movement of many that led to changes thought to be impossible not long before his life. His dream was toward this end, real changes that reflected moral truths that would make life better, physically and practically and legally for everyone. His dream was not a wispy, toothless ideal expressed for the joy of expressing it. It was expressed to inspire, call, and awaken into movement. And while it had tremendous impact in law, it was also not a legal brief. That was for others. His dream was an unabashedly moral claim to equality and fairness, phrased in unabashedly religious language of justice and freedom that awakened innovation and awareness of what is good and true. The great strengths of groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Council was that they made convincing cases that integration and equality were matters not just of legality, but of morality. They argued that equality spoke to the truest religious impulse of this nation, and that the moral health of our country had been and continued to be compromised by inequality. They practiced a progressive religion that saw the holy not only in prayer or liturgy, but in the faces, bodies, and lives of mistreated people. And there they aligned the holy among the persecuted and mistreated, following the model of Jesus and other great teachers who spent their lives healing, defending, and serving the outcast, the oppressed, and the sick. And as he and the larger movement did this, his dream cut like a knife through the complacency with which most white American churches approached racism. Most were largely silent in its face. For generation after generation, the Black church in America was and remains an institution of integrity and support for people under the constant attack of racism, while white churches did little, if anything, to change the culture's profanities. Or the white church actively reflected the evils of racism rather than challenged them. And when a church parrots back the toxic aspects of the larger world, the church itself has become profane and let itself become a tool of unjust power instead of its challenge. This is why the separation of church and state is good not only for the state in terms of freedom for its people, it's good for the church in terms of its own moral clarity. When too closely yoked, religion can destroy the freedom within a state, and the state can annihilate the morality within a church. If a church is serving a state, any state, it's not serving the ultimate, which holds interests much larger than any one passing nation. The holy has no boundaries. Its dream is for all. It carries no flag. Its anthem is breeze and birdsong. It's what King served in his US context, in his ever-expanding ministry that sought more justice and more peace at the expense of none for everyone. This threatened power and wealth, which is what states and industry intend to amass, and are also what the wise ones of many faiths tell us lead the soul of one of many astray. His dream threatened to upend the way power and wealth are packaged in politics, and especially toward the end of his life when he was more focused on class than race, and for this he was slandered and lived in constant danger. This is where King was headed toward the end of his life, toward an increasingly harsh critique of systemic and generational economic inequality. He never stopped fighting racism, but he saw it as interlocked with classism and the generational destructiveness of poverty. His last attempts at organizing were around employment and opportunity, and at the time of his assassination, he was planning another major Washington, D.C. protest around jobs and employment. He had also by then spoken out explicitly in opposition to the war in Vietnam, to militarism in general, which were broad moral claims for him, a proponent of nonviolence, but also more specifically to the class-based sacrifices unequally demanded by the military industry. He saw poor people here and everywhere more likely to die in battle. People of wealth could more easily get out of it if they desired that. This dream was not wispy. It was not comforting. It was poetic and beautiful and inspiring, but it also challenged great powers because it helped sound a collective moral voice. His dream awakened a country, even as he himself, the dreamer, kept awakening to more and more areas in which justice must be voiced and created. The King of the 1963 March dreamt so that we would dream anew today. It was never meant to end there, though that's how we often approach it. Just as he leaned into edge after edge after edge in his own moral and religious thinking, so too should we grow for as long as we are able in our own moral clarity. This is how we can avoid becoming too comfortable with King's legacy, by placing him at that march in the confines of history, knowing that he helped create great change, and then bringing it into our lives today. With his message somewhat frozen in those too few years of his short life, his increasing challenges to structured inequality in this country can be minimized as we celebrate the part of King's legacy that most of society is now comfortable with. And let me be clear, we should absolutely sing praises for King and for those aspects of King. There is no national figure more worthy, and frankly, none for whom I would sing as loudly. We sing praises for one who could paint a vision of the beloved community that could feed the holy fire within a country. We sing praises for one radical, powerful peace, one of radical and powerful peace who showed that swords could be beaten into plowshares and that the whole nation could benefit from that harvest. We sing praises for the person whose life lingers in the clouds of our passing days, whose legacy joins our minds whenever peace and justice and equality are discussed. We sing praises of a person, to be sure, an imperfect person, a very human prophet with flaws and mistakes, marking his too brief life like we all have. But we sing praises for someone fueled by a belief in the overflowing, creative, powerfully transformative qualities of agape, of deep, abiding love for all of humankind. The writer Charles Wilson described this love, this agape at the center of King's ministry, as a teleological kind of love, or a love that is inseparably linked to the destiny of humankind. A teleological love would be a love so deep and ever present that it never separates from one's life and experiences. Even when we don't know that love is there, it's still there. And the practice is to act like that until we know it again. A teleological love corrects division. It counters hatred and creates a healing tension between unloving acts and the loving core of existence. It's a whole and holy love that can propel one through hard, difficult, and trying days because those days are leading to something better. We need to keep singing the praises of that inspired and guided king, of that grade school king, the one I was introduced to so long ago, of that king who captured the hearts and minds of a country. But to be more true to his legacy, we also need to engage the challenges of his later teachings, those that identified systemic oppression based on race and class, those that question the fairness with which people are asked to sacrifice in the military, and those that saw an economic system in which the extreme wealth of some is built through the extreme poverty of many as evil. We need to engage the king that disallows us to turn from racial inequality in our hearts and communities, as well as the one who called to account an economic system that perpetuates crushing poverty. We need to welcome the discomfort, the difficulty in engaging a wider scope of this legacy, a legacy that lives on and needs to be heard in these days. Because King didn't stop expressing his dream in 1963, nor did it stop in 1968 when he was murdered. He is expressing it now, calling us with his words and his life's example to turn toward the marginalized and oppressed, and to challenge the depths of our own morality by questioning to whom and what we are truly accountable. To be true to his legacy, we must continually open our minds and hearts to the justice and compassion for which he lived and died, without regard to what it costs us, without regard for how others characterize us. His dream of an America of equality and opportunity must be realized every day through love by those of us who believe that equality is holy, that diversity is beautiful, and that peace is truly powerful. 60 years after his dream awakened one in hearts long slumbering through complacency, through inequality, through ignorance, through greed, his dream can still awaken us to today's good and true work. His dream can still lead us away from our silos and toward the open air of the beloved community that is our fate's endgame. His march is over, but ours continues. And it won't be the same as his, it can't be, but ours is just as urgent. It is just as moral, and it is just as reliant upon us for its fruition. In our homes, schools, and relationships, our continuing march based on love and building off of all of the great movements before us can lead us to those new edges of justice. It can bring us new chances for collaboration. It can bring forth new possibilities for a better future for us and those to come. But the march is ours. That was true 60 years ago when he was one of the leaders, and it is true now, and it is ever true that the March of Justice is led by people who live for one another and work for the good and true. And while the big marches are really valuable and serve important purposes, they're also rare, and they're not where most of our work is. Most of our marches are through our daily lives, our values expressed in how we live with and among one another, in the ways of our families and friendships and our congregations and our groups that gather for many for life and purpose and joy. The good and true are all aims in these gatherings, and we must always march toward those aims, and we can always stretch toward new edges as we do this. And when we've made good progress, we should sing and celebrate and remember and enjoy. And when times are difficult, we should march with resilient faith and stubborn hope and gritty fortitude, and listen closely for the whispers of the ancestors who are urging us on. And when the naysayers are loud, if we listen, we'll hear the ancestors speak even more loudly and with more confidence, because we won't be experiencing anything that they haven't before. And when someone would obstruct our march, would work against it, would seek to divert us on our journey in the ways of our faith, we must look upon them with hope and hold them in love and keep right on marching until they join in. For none are beyond the redemption of love. May it be so, and amen. And here at the end of our hour, we extinguish our chalice, knowing that light carries us forth until we gather again. Go forth, grateful for the moments before you, the breath within you, the people among you, and the Spirit guiding you toward lives of love and kindness. And go forth knowing that you are held always and always with everyone else by that great love of no beginning and never ending. Go in peace, and amen.